Suspension setup might be the most important parameter for fast, fun and safe riding. It is very complex though, but it doesn't have to be. So let's meet up with the most knowledgeable person I know to talk about it, learn from him and get our bike dialed. Steve, thanks a lot for receiving me here at the Vorsprung suspension facility in Kamloops, BC. So you are the founder, the owner, suspension guru. What makes you an expert in that field?
Always a pleasure to receive you, Remy.
Thank you.
If I were to claim to be an expert in suspension, 2 decades of studying it essentially, automotive engineering background, which came about through my interest in mountain bikes as I grew up racing downhill in Australia. That then led to the creation of Vorsprung, which initially was servicing suspension, and then that grew into tuning it and then designing upgrade parts and then manufacturing them. Eventually, here we are with complete shock absorbers as well as a range of upgrade products.
So in a previous video, I talked about bike setup in general, and I really wanted to meet with you to really take a deep dive into suspension settings. I've learned a ton from working with yourself, and I know the people at home watching this video have a lot of questions on how to set up the bike. But I feel like before even looking at the different steps, we should really be asking the question of what are we trying to achieve when we set up the bike and the suspension.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the easiest way to answer that is to figure out the type of riding that you're trying to do. And so the first thing, you do that implicitly right at the start. You buy a particular type of bike, whether that's downhill bike, cross-country bike, enduro bike, whatever. You've kind of made that decision to some degree when you buy the bike. Understanding the type of bike that you have, the type of trails that you're riding most of the time, that gives you like a good insight into what your priorities are. And from there, you have to figure out like, what are your highest priorities? Is it just not getting beaten up? Is it not crashing on massive hits, like the kind of stuff you like to ride? Is there some compromise between those because you're trying to do both? So how much variety is there in your riding? Like, are you riding bike park, that's really high speed, big hits, big berms that you're hitting really hard, and you're riding sort of slow technical trails on the same bike? Like, that's when you start to see bigger compromises in your setup become necessary. And then you really have to decide, like, what's my number one priority? What am I willing to sacrifice to get that?
Do you agree that a perfect setup that works well everywhere does not exist?
Yeah, I would agree with that. Obviously, you can't go ride, slow speed technical cross country stuff on the same bike that you'd take to Rampage. It's going to suck at one of them, maybe both of them.
But let's say most people that are watching this video have a trail bike, 170 travel,
Yep.
front and rear. They ride their bike on the local trails, also take the bike to the bike park, sometimes fly to a different destination that's got more rocky trail or something like that. Those people, can they have a setup that works well at those different scenarios?
Yeah, you can cover a fairly wide range of scenarios with one bike setup, as long as you understand that it's not going to be perfect at any of them, right? Like, it's not going to be completely optimized for slow speed tech where you want it something soft, and then also sending massive jumps or like huge compressions at high speed. It won't do both of those especially well, but that doesn't mean that you can't find a compromise that works fairly well everywhere.
Exactly.
Right? And I think that's really what most people
And that's what we are going to try to achieve in this video, is to give you the tools to find out a setup that works well for you everywhere, but also the tools to understand how to optimize that setup for making the bike perfect when you go to a different destination or your riding has progressed, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's jump into it. So let's role play. I just got this new bike and I want to set up the suspension correctly. What's my first step?
First step is to try to get the most appropriate spring rates. And the traditional way of doing that is to measure your sag, which is perfectly functional. And that basically involves hopping on the bike, bouncing around to settle it, and then measuring what percentage of the available travel is used just with your weight on it. Right, so if you've got a 150 mil fork and you have compressed the suspension 30 millimeters with your weight on it, you're at 20% sag. Typical rule of thumb is about a 2 to 3 ratio of sag front to rear. So if you're running 20% on the front, 30% on the rear.
And why is that?
It's basically because the bike is not symmetrical. So when you're riding, you're heading down a hill, all the things that are happening, all the events, braking, bumps, whatever, they're all essentially trying to tip you forwards, right? We're not riding dirt bikes where we also have throttle and you can be hard on the gas. So because we're tipped forward by the mountain, we are tipped forward by the brakes, we're tipped forward by every impact, we need the front to be a little bit stiffer than the rear. Humans are also not symmetrical. Obviously you have your hands at the front and feet at the back. So that's why the two tend to have that. And it's just a rule of thumb, it's not a hard and fast rule.
And so you've told me that SAG has got its limitation. In my opinion, one of the difficulty I have with SAG is the accuracy of measuring it. Mm-hmm. It's difficult to be precise when you measure it.
Yep.
But at Vorsprung, you kind of approach the spring rates kind of the opposite way, right?
Yeah, so to understand why we do that, we have to look at why SAG is transferable between riders and bikes. And the answer is basically that, if you are running 25% SAG and everything is dead linear, it takes 4 times your body weight to bottom out the suspension. And whether that's you with 25% on your bike or me with 25% on my bike, it's the same thing, right? It's 4 times the body weight. And then you can adjust that for how much force you can put through the suspension relative to your body weight, how hard you ride, how big a compression your terrain has, things like that. But we try to look at that more directly and just say, okay, well, how much force do you need at bottom out? And then work backwards from there to see what spring rate will give you that. There is limitations within that as well, because the bikes are built to ride at, within a certain SAG window. And so even if the bike is super progressive and realistically using that method, you would have to run 45, 50% SAG, we'll still look at that and be like, well, no, that's outside the range of SAG that the bike's geometry was built to operate at. Because obviously if your bottom bracket is dragging on the ground, it doesn't matter how good your suspension feels. So.
People look at the geometry on paper, but realistically when you ride the bike, your bike is sagging, so therefore your bottom bracket, your angle, everything is slightly different. So
yeah, it is. And the bikes are designed to be ridden in the sagged state. We get the geometry figures at a static, unloaded state, but in reality the geometry that matters is when it's under sag. So we really do have to consider that as a factor. It's more of a limiting factor rather than a target, I would say. So if the bike is designed to run between say 25 and 30% sag, if you're running 35% sag, it's going to be a bit low in the back, right?
But so for most people, you will say that using the regular sag is still a good way to start setting up the bike?
Yeah, I think so. There are online spring calculators as well. We have one on our tuning hub. TF Tuned have a really good one. I think that's kind of considered the industry benchmark for rear shocks at least. For forks, generally speaking, if you're running a stock OEM fork, there's usually a chart on the back. Just go and have a look at that. That's the shortcut.
That's a good starting point.
Yeah, and it might turn out to be completely inappropriate for you, but it's a starting point and it involves nothing other than looking at the sticker.
I've got my spring rate. Now, what is my step number 2?
Step number 2 is typically setting your rebound damping. You can bounce around in the parking lot and actually get a reasonable feel for where your rebound is set at. So some manufacturers, particularly for forks, it's a bit easier because you don't have a linkage that complicates things, will provide recommended rebound settings. So Fox and RockShox both do that for their forks. You can look at those recommended settings for your weight and for the air pressure that you're running. They're a reasonable place to start. Again, they might not be where you end up, but it's a completely reasonable place to start to begin with. And then realistically, how much you change that in either direction, whether you make it slower or faster, is dependent on your preferences and the terrain that you ride. So when you ride really fast, like braking bump stuff, like half a mountain here, typically really fast rebound is beneficial. But then if you're riding, say, the North Shore, you're riding Seymour or something like that, big compressions, lots of big holes, and predictability at lower speed is a bigger concern, then you might need it a bit slower.
Yeah, I feel like people, including myself, have that idea that a slower rebound is safer, but a faster rebound is often more efficient. Do you think that's correct? More efficient because the suspension has time to come back to its initial point in between impact, and therefore you can get better grip as long as the fork is not bouncing around. Whereas a slower rebound means that the suspension might back down a little bit, become uncomfortable, and also not provide you grip.
Yeah, there is some truth to that, and that comes back to the terrain variations to a large degree. So when you're riding over braking bumps and corrugations at very high speed, the frequency the fork wants to move at is high, right? And so you want to open up the damping to allow it to do that more freely. That same damping, you might find that when you have big steppy compressions, that the fork feels like it compresses, and rather than controlling the rebound and allowing your body to continue at a sort of smooth trajectory, it bounces you back up, and it just feels mistimed. And so they're the kind of two extremes where you'll notice the biggest differences when your rebound is too fast or too slow.
So what's my third step?
So the third step is typically looking at your bottoming protection and or travel use, just because it's the low-hanging fruit. You can certainly go and play with your compression adjusters first, but the compression adjustments don't have a huge effect on your bottoming resistance, particularly on forks. On shocks, it does have more of an effect, just because they're a bit more heavily damped. But that means if you're running coil suspension, like a Telum or a Smashpot, you typically adjust your HBO.
Actually bottom out.
Yeah. Or if you're running air suspension, you'll adjust your volume spacer configuration. So if you are using full travel too easily and you're bottoming out hard too frequently, then you'll add spacers, keep the pressure the same, ideally. If you are unable to use full travel, you'll pull them out. So that is kind of how you adjust the last, let's say, 30% of the travel. That's where the volume spacers are really dominant.
As you would have expected, this video is brought to you by Vorsprung Suspension. I've been super excited about this partnership for obvious reasons, the quality of the product, but also because I'm gonna be learning a lot more about suspension, helping with the development of new products, and I'm gonna share all of that with you on the channel. And to celebrate this, Vorsprung just gave me a code. If you purchase a Telum plus a Secus or a Smashpot together, then you receive 10% off with the code REMY. Now let's get back to our video. What would you say to someone that tend to put too many volume spacers, thinking that more volume spacer is better?
So what volume spacers really let you do is get a certain amount of bottoming protection, but with a softer initial spring rate, right? So as you increase the number of spaces in there, and you basically are compressing the air into a smaller and smaller space at bottom out, so the pressure ramps up higher. That basically means that you can adjust, the initial spring rate versus the late stroke spring rate. If you take that too far by adding too many volume spacers and running too low of pressure, you ride really low into the travel. So besides the geometry effects of that, what that means is that you don't have a lot of positive travel left in the soft spring rate region before you run into a really firm spring rate region. And so then you spend a lot of time in that really firm part of the travel. And so that can really feel like just running into a wall. And that's actually a common trap to fall into.
Because often people want to use volume spacer in order to have a bike that feels comfortable at the start of the travel and then ramps up to give you protection.
Yes.
But too much progressivity means that you're too much in the travel all the time. So actually every time the suspension starts to really activate, you're straight into the protection part, and therefore you make everything harsher.
Exactly. Yeah, so you want to just give yourself a bit more space from that if you can. If you're in that situation, the alternative is typically get the bottoming protection from increasing the spring rate, so the coil or the air spring pressure. So if you increase the spring rate, you do it everywhere through the travel. You add 10 psi more, that affects every part of the travel equivalently. That sometimes is the answer, right? Because if your spring rate is just too soft, but the thing is actually reasonably progressive already, then if you're still bottoming, it just needs to be stiffer. If you're getting beaten up at that point, then we have other questions to ask and answer.
What's the best way to figure out if you need or not to increase progressivity on your suspension? Can you figure out on the parking lot?
Not in the parking lot for most people. You maybe can, but I would say most people not really. you have to actually go and find the places on the trail where you bottom your bike out, right? And they're not always where you think they're going to be. Sometimes they are in gentle, or not even necessarily gentle compressions, but slower compressions, right? It's like big, slow ones where the bike is under a lot of pressure for a long time and it has time to move through the travel. Sometimes things that feel really harsh don't actually use that much travel. So like landings to flat, they also use a lot more of the damping, so they don't necessarily get right deep into the travel in the same way. Even corners where there's big holes cut in them, so your bike is already like loaded up with your full weight in the corner, and then the wheel catches a sharp edge, and you've only got maybe 20 mil of travel left at that point. Those kind of situations you can bottom out fairly hard in, and then you have to figure out, well, do I need to be higher in the travel to begin with? Do I need a stiffer spring rate and more energy stored in the spring before I even get late in the travel? Or is it just that I need a little bit of a kick of force towards the end of the stroke to protect me from like just hard contact?
Step 4, I assume it's the compression, but low speed, high speed compression, where do we start and what's even compression?
So compression damping is resistance to movement that's dependent on how fast the suspension is compressing, in the same way that rebound damping is resistance to extension, right? So the job of the damper is to slow the movement down, to control it. In the case of compression damping, its primary job on a mountain bike is to stabilize the rider. So to stop you just blowing through the travel too quickly and ending up deep in the travel. So it dissipates some energy as heat, and that's essentially its primary function. So that makes it quite terrain sensitive. So the more big holes that you're in where the bike is kind of getting pitched back and forwards and bucking like that, the more the compression damping matters. If you're riding stuff that doesn't tend to have those kind of big undulations like that are close together, again, like Harper Mountain's a great example of like mostly high-speed single track, that's like just a lot of small corrugations. In those situations, the lighter damping is typically advantageous. If, again, going back to the North Shore, if you're riding in Seymour or somewhere like that, lots of big compressions, or even the trails around Whistler, right? Where you've got a lot of stuff where you've got like step, or high speed. 19th hole in Squamish, perfect example. There, the compression really helps settle the bike by just stabilizing it, dissipating energy, and letting the bike get to, essentially its turnaround point in the travel, faster, which means that it gets there sooner, it's able to return quicker, everything stabilizes, you don't end up with the same extremes of spring force occurring. Now, it's hard to generalize how to set up compression because compression dampers vary wildly in the way that they function. So whether that's the fork damper, the rear shock, different manufacturers use different methodologies, right? So the way that the RockShox dampers work with their high-speed compression is completely different to the way that the Fox dampers or our damper, like the Telum, work, for example. So there are a lot of nuances in there that mean I'll avoid making generalizations, but that is basically the purpose of the compression damping. So again, if you've got lots of steps, things that need stabilizing where you're worried about the stability of the bike, that's where you typically want more. If you don't have so much of that and you've just got more small bump, that's where you typically want less.
So your compression has a huge impact in managing the balance of the bike.
Yes.
Now the low speed versus high speed.
Mm-hmm.
Some people believe that low speed is when you go slow, high speed is when you go fast. Can you explain us exactly what that means?
Yeah, so the low and the high speed don't refer to the speed of the bike, they refer to the speed that the suspension itself is moving at. You can have fairly high speed suspension movements at relatively low bike speed. You can ride off a drop, like wheelie drop to flat, you'll actually get fairly high shaft speeds. Likewise, you can be moving very fast on the bike through gentle undulations.
Yeah, like big berms.
Yeah, it's very low speeds. It's very hard to generalize again because the way the dampers that are out there in the real world function varies a lot on the compression side. No two compression adjusters do the same thing between different models of damper. So it's hard to say this is the exact scenario that you use low speed and this is the exact scenario that you use high speed, because what's true for a Charger 3, for example, is not true for a Grip X2. There's some overlap, but they're not exactly the same thing. So it's without deep diving into each individual damper, that's where we
Okay,
are.
but that's interesting. So towards the end of this video, we're actually gonna run through different scenario. I'll ask you a question. Hey, this is how my bike feels, and it feels wrong. What should I change? So a lot of it will be about compression. Now, if we look at just like general ideas that viewers and riders have, the low-speed compression, in which case do you think it's particularly important?
It's particularly important for managing dive on really steep terrain for a fork. For the rear shock, it has a large effect on pedaling, strangely. Well, maybe not strangely. It has a large effect on pedaling. It has a large effect on how the bike behaves when you're seated if you're not using a lockout. All those kind of slow movements where you don't have the ability necessarily to compensate for what the bike is doing. But the low-speed compression is typically, it has an influence on small bump harshness to a fairly large degree and dive on steep stuff in the fork. It doesn't really stabilize the bike as much as the high-speed compression typically. Again, there are variations between dampers here. So what is true for one isn't necessarily true for another, but that's the general gist of that.
So does that mean that high-speed compression is what a rider is gonna mostly feel when it goes really fast and hit like a super sharp edge, or therefore do a hug to flat?
Yeah, the high-speed damping is dominant there. The low-speed damping still has a considerable effect even on the sharp edge stuff. And in fact, sometimes particularly on the sharp edge stuff, because when the wheel starts moving, when the suspension starts moving, it accelerates from, let's say, 0 speed, right? So it's not moving initially, and then it starts moving through that low speed region, and then into the high speed, and then it slows down again at the end. So the low speed damping, the wheel is still engaging that, regardless of the fact that it's maybe dominated by the high speed. One of the interesting effects of excessive low speed damping, particularly in forks, is that if there is a lot of low speed damping, like say you have a low force threshold lockout, so you have a lot of effectively infinite damping because it takes some amount of force to get the fork moving in the first place, that delays the acceleration of the wheel. And that means that whatever obstacle you're hitting, whatever bump you're hitting, there's more intrusion to the tire. And that builds up the force that's stored in the tire, which is also a spring. And then that means that you get, ironically, higher shaft velocities out of it. And so that's one of the ways that excessive low-speed damping can actually cause high-speed harshness. Even though when you look at it on a dyno, you have very low forces there and so on and so forth, and you think, okay, well, this gets up to a very high velocity that's well outside the range that the low-speed affects. It still actually can have a significant effect there. So over-damping with low speed can certainly cause problems. Under-damping with low speed, there are problems associated, like I said, particularly brake dive, on steeper terrain.
But often you can compensate that with a higher spring rate.
You can. There's always compromises with doing that as well, right? Like if you try to use spring rate for everything, eventually you end up with something that's much too stiff. And you could have had a softer, more comfortable setup that managed the dive and the stability on the steep stuff better with more damping. So yeah, you often have to like iterate between the two, right?
I often feel like a bike that runs a lot of damping for me feels safer because on impacts, the way the bike travels through the travel, essentially, the way the suspension compresses is more controlled.
Yes.
So therefore I experience less inadequate reaction from the bike.
Yep. Yeah, that's absolutely right. The damping is there to dissipate energy rather than the spring storing it and giving it back to you. So that's essentially how much damping you have in compression and rebound determines how much energy you get back out of the spring when it's compressed. And that energy is what destabilizes you, you know?
Okay.
So you want a certain amount back. Obviously, you want the wheels to be able to track the ground, and you also want to be able to pop the bike and jump it and things like that. So it's not that that's all bad, but yeah, damping is what stabilizes you.
Thanks a lot for watching that video. I hope you enjoy some of the tips and knowledge that Steve has shared with you. Myself, I learned quite a few things. So now I'm gonna take this bike, I'm gonna go for a lap. Hopefully my setup is dialed, and if it's not the case, I'll come back to see Steve, and hopefully we can fix it to make it feel even better. Next week's video is gonna be really cool because we're gonna be looking at the most common complaint people have about their suspension and how to fix and change that. It's gonna be awesome, so make sure you subscribe, leave us a like and drop a comment. Steve will personally go and reply to that. And if you want to learn more about Vorsprung suspension, there is a link down below. See you next week.